In the heart of Virginia stands a house upon a hill, quiet and grand, its white columns gleaming against the dark sweep of the Blue Ridge Mountains. From afar, Monticello looks like perfection itself, a vision of reason, symmetry, and order, crafted by the hand of a man who believed in the power of human thought. The air around it is still, reverent even, as if time itself hesitates before crossing its threshold. Yet if you listen long enough, if you stand beneath those arches when the wind moves through the trees, you might sense it, that something in this place has never truly slept. Within these walls, liberty was spoken into existence, but another kind of story lived in the silence between those words. It is said that the mind of Thomas Jefferson built Monticello, but the lives of others made it breathe. Beneath the polished floors and beneath the sunlight that pours through the dome, there were corridors that ran dark, rooms that stayed hidden, and footsteps that history refused to name. The master's world and the enslaved world existed side by side, separated by wood, by law, by will. The man who declared that all men are created equal lived surrounded by those he denied that promise. And in that contradiction, in that quiet deception built into the heart of his home, there was one story the house tried to keep. A room, tucked close to Jefferson's own chamber, sealed from light, forgotten for generations. No portraits were painted there, no records left behind, and yet it was within that narrow space that a woman lived, a woman history would not let rest. Her name was Sally Hemings. She was enslaved by Jefferson, tied to him by law and by blood, and for decades, she moved through Monticello like a shadow at noon, visible but unacknowledged, known but never spoken of. The walls that once echoed with Jefferson's eloquence also carried her silence. They heard her breath, her work, her laughter with her children who would never be publicly claimed. They held the weight of secrets too heavy for any generation to bear. For years, her story was dismissed, reduced to rumor, pushed into the corners of polite history. But a house can only hold its truth for so long. When archaeologists broke through the brick and dust of Monticello's foundations centuries later, they found a hollow space where none should exist, stone, ash, fragments of life long gone. A room without windows, but not without memory. The discovery forced the world to look again at the man it had called a hero. It forced the question no monument wants to answer: how can freedom and bondage share the same roof? This house on the hill was meant to stand as a symbol of enlightenment. Yet beneath its perfect balance, another story waited, one built not from marble and ink, but from silence and survival. And as the sun sets behind Monticello, and the light fades from the windows, you can almost feel the truth pressing outward, whispering through the cracks of time. Behind the beauty, behind the genius, there was a door that was never meant to be opened. Tonight, we step beyond it. Thomas Jefferson was the image of the American ideal. To the world, he was the mind that gave birth to liberty, the pen that shaped a nation's conscience. He stood among the giants of his age, philosopher, scientist, architect, statesman, his words echoing across centuries, his name woven into the fabric of freedom itself. The Declaration of Independence was his masterpiece, a promise to mankind that reason and equality would guide a new world. His vision was vast, his curiosity endless. He could design a house with the same precision he used to design a government. Every wall, every staircase, every angle of Monticello spoke of a man who believed in order, logic, and control. Visitors who came to his home were greeted not by a plantation, but by a world of ideas. He filled his rooms with inventions, instruments, books, and models of the universe. The house reflected the man, elegant, deliberate, balanced. To walk its halls was to step inside Jefferson's mind, each space calculated to please the eye, each view aligned to the horizon he so carefully chose. He was the embodiment of enlightenment, a man who saw himself as both thinker and creator, shaping not just his home, but the future of a republic. He spoke of virtue, of justice, of the natural rights of man. He dreamed of a country governed by reason rather than tyranny, by education rather than ignorance. To his admirers, he was the very symbol of progress, a man who could stand among kings and yet call himself a servant of the people. They saw in him the best of humanity, brilliance without arrogance, ambition without cruelty, refinement without corruption. His words, his manners, his intellect all seemed to promise that humanity could rise above its flaws. But perfection, when examined closely, begins to reveal its cracks. Jefferson's life was a study in balance, yet the scales he held were uneven. The man who wrote that freedom was the birthright of all kept hundreds bound in silence. The same hands that drafted the words, "All men are created equal," signed documents that reduced others to property. The contradiction was not spoken of in polite company. It was tucked away, polished over, smoothed into the marble of his reputation. To question it was to question the very foundation of the nation he helped build. So the world looked upward, toward the dome of Monticello, admiring its symmetry and grace, never wondering what truths lay beneath. His admirers saw his legacy, his neighbors saw his grandeur, and his country saw its own reflection in him, brilliant, flawed, unwilling to face its own shadow. Jefferson was both architect and enigma, crafting beauty from reason and hiding disquiet beneath civility. And while the world celebrated his genius, Monticello itself remembered what he tried to forget. Monticello was more than a home, it was a world within a world. From a distance, it appeared serene, its white columns and perfect symmetry rising above the rolling green hills of Virginia. But step closer, and you would feel the divide that ran through its very foundation. Above were the grand rooms, filled with polished furniture, scientific instruments, and the quiet hum of conversation. Below, unseen and unspoken of, lay the hidden heart of the estate, the quarters of the enslaved, the kitchens, the passageways that connected labor to luxury. The estate was built like its master's mind, precise, deliberate, and layered. Every detail was measured, every view designed to conceal as much as it revealed. Beneath the terraces stretched a network of brick chambers known as the dependencies, rooms for work, for storage, for lives that were never meant to be visible. Narrow corridors wound through the underbelly of the house, ceilings low, air heavy. These paths were the arteries that kept Monticello alive, allowing enslaved men and women to move unseen, carrying food, messages, and burdens between the master's world and their own. There were stairs few visitors ever noticed, hidden steps that rose from the service quarters to the upper floors, connecting the private rooms of Jefferson to the spaces of those who served him. In the quiet of night, these passages came alive with soft movements, the hush of feet on wood, the sound of work continuing long after the lights above had gone dim. The symmetry of Monticello was more than beauty, it was control. Every wall was built to maintain appearances, to keep the machinery of servitude hidden behind civility. But the walls remember. Centuries later, when time and silence had done their best to erase what once existed, archaeologists came to Monticello seeking the stories that history had buried. They began with blueprints and fragments, with rumors of a space that no one could find. And then, behind a layer of brick near Jefferson's own chamber, they uncovered it, a narrow room, sealed and forgotten. There were no windows. The air inside was still, as though it had been waiting. The floor was made of worn brick. Traces of a hearth lay against the far wall, its edges blackened by the memory of fire. Small remnants, iron nails, bits of wood, fragments of ceramic, told of a life lived quietly, carefully, within the confines of that space. It was not a storage room, nor a servant's passage. It was a room of habitation, of presence. And its location told a story words had long refused to tell. For just beyond that thin wall stood Jefferson's own bedroom. The proximity was unmistakable, deliberate, undeniable. This was no accident of design. This was intimacy built into architecture. This was where Sally Hemings lived. To stand in that space was to feel the weight of two worlds pressed against each other, the world of power and the world of silence. The man who shaped Monticello had hidden his greatest contradiction in its very structure. The house itself had kept the secret he never confessed, its perfection concealing the truth that freedom and bondage were never as far apart as the world wanted to believe. She was born in 1773, in Virginia, at a time when freedom was a word spoken only by those who already possessed it. Her name was Sally Hemings, and her life began in the shadow of another family's power. Her mother, Betty Hemings, was an enslaved woman of mixed ancestry, and her father, John Wales, was a white plantation owner, the same man who fathered Jefferson's wife, Martha. That made Sally the half-sister of the woman Jefferson had once loved, the woman whose death left him shattered. It also meant that by blood, Sally was three-quarters European, and yet the law saw her as nothing more than property. Those who saw her described her as light-skinned, almost white, with features that blurred the cruel lines society had drawn between race and ownership. She grew up within the tangled hierarchy of Monticello, caught between privilege and bondage, a child raised among the family but never a part of it. The world into which she was born had already decided her fate, long before she could speak it. When Jefferson left for France to serve as the American minister, he took his youngest daughter, Maria, with him. 2 years later, he sent for another of his daughters to join them, and with her went Sally Hemings, just 14 years old. For the first time, she crossed the ocean that divided the old world from the new, leaving behind the plantation that had shaped her childhood. France was a place unlike any she had known, a place where ideas of liberty and equality filled the air, where music drifted from open windows, and where the law did not recognize slavery. In Paris, Sally was free. Not by kindness, not by permission, but by law. She could have walked away at any moment. She could have claimed the life denied to her since birth. But freedom, as she would learn, was never that simple. She was still young, thousands of miles from home, surrounded by a language she barely spoke, and tied to a man whose power stretched across continents. Jefferson was not just her master, he was the guardian of her family, the father of the children she had cared for, and the figure whose authority she had never been allowed to question. It was in Paris that their connection began to change. She was no longer the child from Monticello but a young woman seen through a different gaze, one that would alter both their lives forever. The precise nature of that relationship would never be recorded, but its consequence would echo through generations. What is known is this. While in France, Sally became pregnant. She was faced with a choice no one her age should have had to make, to stay and claim her freedom, or to return to America, where that freedom would be taken from her again. Jefferson promised her something in exchange for her return, that her children would one day be free. And so she agreed. The ship that carried them back to Virginia bore not just passengers, but a secret that would live inside the walls of Monticello for decades. The young girl who had briefly tasted liberty stepped once more into a world that saw her as less than human. Her life from that moment would exist between two worlds, the one she could never escape, and the one she had almost touched. And when she set foot again on Virginia soil, the hill of Monticello rose before her like a memory that would not let go. The man who had promised liberty to a nation had bound her to a life of quiet captivity. History would forget her voice, but the choices made in that moment would shape everything that followed, for her children, and for the man whose words claimed all men were created equal. Paris in 1787 was a city alive with ideas, a place where the air itself seemed to hum with the promise of change. The streets were filled with music, debate, and laughter, merchants calling from their stalls, philosophers arguing in cafes, revolution whispering just beyond the horizon. To those who came from America, Paris was a vision of freedom made real. Here, titles meant less, skin meant less, and a person's worth could, at least for a moment, be measured by wit and intellect rather than by birth. It was a world of beauty and contradiction, a world Thomas Jefferson both admired and envied. Jefferson arrived in Paris as a widower, a man still shadowed by loss. His wife, Martha, had been gone for years, and though he spoke of her rarely, the absence seemed to live in him like a second soul. He filled his days with study, architecture, art, and the company of France's thinkers. But when the day ended and the city lights dimmed, he was alone, a man building nations in his mind yet unable to mend the quiet in his heart. Into this world came Sally Hemings, the young girl who had once moved through his Virginia home unnoticed. Now, under the Parisian sky, she had become something else entirely, graceful, composed, her childhood slipping away behind her. Those who saw her in the Jefferson household remarked on her resemblance to his late wife, the same gentle eyes, the same quiet bearing. To Jefferson, still mourning, still restless, the likeness may have felt like both comfort and temptation. The world around them was filled with ideas of liberty, equality, and the rights of man, yet within that house, the old American hierarchy followed them across the ocean. He was still the master, she, still the enslaved. And yet, something began between them. Something that defied every law of decency and power, yet bound their lives together beyond undoing. Sally was only 14 when she arrived in France, and as the months passed, she became part of Jefferson's private world, caring for his daughter, living within the rhythms of his household, drawn into his orbit by circumstance and control. By the time she was 16, she was carrying his child. It was a truth too dangerous to name, even in a city that prided itself on freedom. For in France, slavery was illegal. The law saw her not as property, but as a person. And that one fact changed everything. She had power, however fragile. She could leave him. She could stay in Paris and live free. Others before her had done it, enslaved men and women who vanished into the streets of that city, never to be claimed again. Jefferson knew it, and she knew it. What passed between them then was not romance but negotiation, a quiet exchange that would determine the course of her life and the lives of her children. She agreed to return to Virginia only if he swore that her future children would be free when they came of age. He promised. And so, she boarded the ship with him. The voyage home was long, the waters dark and endless, as if the sea itself were swallowing what had happened in France. By the time the shores of America rose on the horizon, Sally Hemings was no longer a girl. She was a woman carrying both a secret and a promise, bound by words that only the two of them would ever truly know. When the ship reached Virginia, the hills of Monticello waited, the house gleaming in the sunlight, its dome serene, its secrets undisturbed. For the world, Jefferson's return was a triumph. For Sally, it was a quiet surrender. The law that had declared her free was left behind in another country, and the promise of liberty now lived only in the fate of the children she had yet to bear. She walked back through the familiar halls of Monticello, past the faces that knew her, past the rooms that watched her grow, and into the life that would define her forever, a life lived in silence beside the man who had promised the world its freedom. Back at Monticello, Sally Hemings's life folded into silence. She did not return to the fields or the quarters where most of the enslaved labored under the sun. Her place was within the great house itself, behind its polished doors and drawn curtains, where work was quieter but no less binding. She served as a chambermaid, tending to Jefferson's personal rooms, his clothing, his bed, the order he demanded in every inch of his world. She was always near, yet never seen. Guests passed through Monticello's halls praising its beauty, its grace, its owner's intellect, unaware, or unwilling to know, that the woman moving in its shadows was bound to him in ways no one dared name. The rhythm of her days followed his. When he rose, she was already awake. When he wrote, she prepared the space. She brought water for his washing, polished his instruments, and ensured that the small, domestic rituals of his genius continued uninterrupted. To the outside world, she was invisible. Her name never appeared in his letters or records except as a faint, passing note, a mark of service, not of personhood. Yet she was closer to him than anyone else in the house. Only a narrow corridor separated their rooms, a hidden passageway that allowed her to move unseen when night came. The house itself seemed built to keep secrets. Its design allowed the enslaved to work without being noticed, to serve without acknowledgement. Beneath the main floor ran tunnels for movement, doorways tucked behind panels, stairs hidden in corners. Silence was part of the architecture, a deliberate concealment of the hands that kept the illusion of gentility alive. And in that silence, Sally's life took shape, half in view, half erased. She lived in the space between two worlds. To the enslaved community of Monticello, she was one of them, yet set apart by her proximity to the master. To Jefferson's world, she did not exist at all, though her presence lingered in every private corner he occupied. Her children, born within those same walls, would inherit both her silence and his name, though neither could be spoken aloud. At night, when the house grew still and the last candlelight dimmed, footsteps echoed through the narrow hall connecting her room to his. The boards creaked, the air grew heavy, and Monticello settled into its secret rhythm. Those moments would never be written down, never witnessed except by the walls themselves. The man who spoke of liberty by day kept his own captivity by night, a bond that neither law nor morality could untangle. The enslaved who worked outside sometimes whispered of lights burning late in the main house, of quiet movements where no master should be. But no one asked, and no one told. The truth was a currency too dangerous to hold. The house understood this, and it kept its silence. And so she lived, steps away from one of the most powerful men in America, yet erased from the world that celebrated him. Her existence was measured not in recognition, but in the unseen labor that sustained his comfort, his image, his order. Monticello stood as a monument to enlightenment, but within its symmetry was a life lived in the dimness, a woman who moved like a shadow through history, close enough to touch power, yet forever kept from its light. Within the stillness of Monticello, life unfolded in secret. Behind the doors of that hidden room and within the quiet rhythm of the great house, Sally Hemings bore 6 children. Their names were seldom written in the ledgers, their births rarely marked in ink, yet the house knew. The other enslaved people knew. And Jefferson knew. History would try to forget them, but the blood that bound them refused to disappear. The first 2 children did not live long enough to leave much trace beyond rumor and memory. Their names are lost to time, their small lives absorbed into the silence that Monticello demanded. But 4 others survived. Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston, children born into bondage, yet destined to carry a promise whispered between their parents years earlier in a city across the sea. Jefferson's promise had been simple and impossible all at once, that they would one day be free. Each birth took place under the weight of secrecy. No announcements, no christenings, no record in Jefferson's carefully kept journals. The man who documented every seed planted in his garden, every sunrise, every thought of philosophy, wrote nothing of the lives born in his own home. And yet, the evidence of those lives lingered everywhere. In the quiet smiles exchanged among the servants, in the eyes of children whose faces mirrored their fathers, in the uneasy hush that fell when certain names were spoken. Sally's pregnancies passed without public notice, her labors tended by the women who understood that silence was survival. The enslaved community at Monticello carried the secret carefully, knowing that to speak it was to risk everything. Even in later years, their descendants would recall those births as facts never recorded but always known. The children grew under Jefferson's roof, half his blood, half the world he kept enslaved. Beverly and Harriet would later vanish into white society, their skin light enough to pass unnoticed, their lineage erased by necessity. Madison and Eston would be freed in Jefferson's will, carrying his unspoken legacy into a world that would never acknowledge their connection. The others, too young or too vulnerable, never saw the day promised to them. Every child was born within reach of their father's private chambers, many likely in the very room that had once been sealed from history. Each new life reminded the house of its own contradiction, the master of liberty, watching his own children grow up as property. And through it all, Sally remained silent, carrying both her children and her captivity with the same steady strength. The records of Monticello spoke of weather, of harvests, of philosophy and invention, but they did not speak of her pain or her love. For the world, she did not exist. For her children, she was everything. She kept the promise alive when it might have been easier to let it die. But the freedom she bargained for never came to her. Her body remained bound by the same laws that had ruled her mother's life, even as her children walked slowly, painfully, toward the liberty that had been denied to them both. In the end, the house that hid her gave birth to a lineage it could never acknowledge. Freedom was promised, but it came only to her children, never to her. They said the resemblance was unmistakable. The curve of the jaw, the reddish tint of the hair, the way the eyes softened when deep in thought, all echoes of the man who stood at the very top of Monticello's world. Visitors whispered about it in letters never meant for public eyes. Overseers saw it and looked away. The enslaved knew it and kept their silence. Jefferson's children moved through the estate like reflections he could not deny, yet dared not claim. At the great table, their father dined among guests who praised his intellect, his architecture, his vision for a free nation. Down below, in the quiet hum of the quarters, his children laughed, played, and grew under the weight of a secret that shaped every breath they took. The plantation existed on an unspoken agreement, that what was seen would not be said, that what was known would never pass beyond those hills. The people at Monticello learned to speak in glances. A servant would avert his eyes when one of the lighter-skinned children passed by. A guest might raise a brow but say nothing. The walls of the house became keepers of shame, protectors of contradiction. Jefferson's public writings celebrated liberty and equality, yet his private world lived on quiet hierarchy, the father and the enslaved woman, their children bound to silence. As the children grew older, the likeness deepened. Beverly's face carried the unmistakable mark of Jefferson's lineage. Harriet's smile resembled the portraits hanging in the main hall. The younger boys, Madison and Eston, shared their father's height, his manner, even his voice. To strangers, they could have been relatives, cousins perhaps, visiting the great man of Virginia. But in truth, they were his sons. Still, they lived with the knowledge that they were both privileged and condemned, favored above others yet denied their own names. They received certain kindnesses, lighter duties, better clothes, the quiet protection that came with proximity to the master. But it was a fragile mercy, never spoken, never safe. Their existence was a living contradiction, proof of the very injustice Jefferson's pen had condemned. When freedom finally touched them, through manumission or quiet escape, it came with a heavy cost. Beverly and Harriet slipped away into the world of white America, passing as those who had never been enslaved, leaving their true names and history behind. For them, freedom meant erasure. Madison and Eston, too, carried their heritage into the open, though it followed them like a ghost. They bore the weight of their father's silence, the knowledge that the man who wrote that all men are created equal could not bring himself to say the same of them. In Monticello, their story lingered like a whisper between the rooms. The slaves who watched them grow old remembered. The guests who noticed their faces remembered. Even after the house fell quiet and the voices faded, the walls seemed to remember. They had seen what history would one day uncover, that the man who shaped a nation also shaped a hidden lineage, one that looked just like him, yet was never meant to be seen. Monticello stood as the masterpiece of a visionary, a man who shaped a republic from words and reason. Its columns gleamed white against the Virginia hills, its symmetry perfect, its gardens ordered like the pages of his philosophy. Visitors called it a monument to enlightenment, a reflection of the mind that had penned the Declaration of Independence. Yet within its perfect balance, there was imbalance. Beneath its elegance, a shadow stretched long. Thomas Jefferson had written that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But those words, so bold and eternal on parchment, faltered inside his own walls. For beneath the very rooms where he dreamed of freedom, dozens lived in chains. And among them was the woman who bore his children, still enslaved, still denied the very liberty he proclaimed as sacred. He had written of race with the calm authority of a scholar, arguing that people of African descent were inferior in both mind and body. Those words became part of America's intellectual foundation, a justification for cruelty cloaked in reason. Yet, each morning, Jefferson rose in the same house where those words were refuted by the living truth of Sally Hemings and their children. Every glance at them, every heartbeat echoing down the narrow halls, was proof that his theories were lies of his own making. In his study, he wrote about progress, virtue, and the destiny of the new nation. Outside, enslaved men and women labored in his fields, built his terraces, and maintained the beauty that the world admired. The same hands that wrote the words of liberty also locked the doors of another's freedom. Monticello was not just his home, it was a mirror. It reflected the split within his soul and within the country he helped create. Upstairs, sunlight filled the rooms, glinting off polished wood and books lined in perfect order. Downstairs, in the dim light of the dependencies, the enslaved moved in silence. The walls themselves divided two worlds, refinement above, bondage below. The air shifted between them, carrying the smell of meals cooked by unseen hands to the plates of those who spoke of democracy. And through it all, Jefferson's contradictions held steady, neither collapsing nor confessing. To the public, he remained the philosopher of freedom, the architect of a nation. To those beneath him, he was the keeper of their captivity, a man who could dream of liberty for mankind, yet deny it to those under his own roof. Monticello became more than a home, it became a monument to America's unresolved truth. Its beauty and its hypocrisy were built brick by brick, inseparable and eternal. The foundation of the Republic stood upon both, the soaring ideal and the buried reality, one carved into history, the other hidden in the earth beneath it. More than 2 centuries after Sally Hemings walked those halls, Monticello still stood, its beauty untouched, its symmetry flawless, yet its silence, restless. For generations, visitors had admired its architecture, unaware that one of its greatest truths lay sealed behind a wall. Beneath the main house, beyond the polished floors and stately corridors, a forgotten room waited to be remembered. In 2017, as part of a long effort to restore the hidden lives of Monticello's enslaved people, archaeologists began to examine the south wing of the mansion. The blueprints were clear, or so they thought. But beneath layers of plaster and brick, something unexpected appeared. A faint outline. A wall that shouldn't have been there. When they began to remove the bricks, inch by inch, the shape of a small room emerged, dark and airless, untouched since the days Jefferson walked above it. The measurements told a story before the artifacts did. The space was narrow and low, without a single window. Just beyond its wall, separated by a few feet of timber and plaster, was Jefferson's own private suite, his bedroom and study. For decades, historians had debated whether Sally Hemings had lived so close to him, or whether that intimacy was myth. But the structure itself offered no room for denial. The room was real. The proximity was undeniable. As the excavation continued, fragments of ordinary life began to surface, nails blackened by time, pieces of pottery, the faint trace of a hearth where fire once burned. A small fireplace, its bricks worn smooth, spoke of warmth in the cold Virginia winters, of hands tending flames in the quiet hours. The air carried the faint smell of old smoke, sealed for centuries. In those traces, the archaeologists found not just evidence, but presence. Each discovery stitched together the story that history had tried to unthread. The room, once dismissed as rumor, now stood as testimony. It was no storage space. It was lived in. And its placement, just steps from Jefferson's chamber, was too deliberate to be coincidence. The architecture itself had become confession. When the restoration team stepped back, the silence of the room felt heavier than its size. There were no letters from Sally Hemings, no diary, no written defense. Yet here, the walls spoke for her. They whispered of nights spent in secrecy, of children born in the shadows, of a woman both captive and irreplaceable. For centuries, historians argued about the truth of her life, whether the stories of her relationship with Jefferson were real or imagined. But now, the earth beneath Monticello had spoken. The space itself bore witness to what generations had only whispered. The walls spoke, and they told Sally's story. For nearly 2 centuries, history kept her name at the edge of silence. In the grand biographies written about Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings appeared only as a shadow, if she appeared at all. She was called the servant, the girl, the mystery. Words chosen not to describe her, but to erase her. Jefferson's admirers wrote of his genius, his intellect, his legacy. They praised his architecture, his eloquence, his vision of liberty. Yet when it came to the woman who shared his bed and bore his children, the pages grew thin, the ink went quiet. Even his own family worked to bury the truth. For generations, Jefferson's descendants denied that their blood intertwined with hers. They rewrote family stories, dismissed the whispers of resemblance, and branded those who spoke otherwise as liars. Monticello's walls might have remembered, but the written record was cleansed. The man of reason, they insisted, could not have lived such a contradiction. And so, for years, historians followed their lead, protecting the myth, not the woman. The rumors, however, never disappeared. They lingered through letters, through oral histories passed down by the Hemings descendants, through quiet defiance in the enslaved community's memories. But without proof, the world chose doubt. Scholars dismissed the accounts as exaggeration, as gossip, as impossible. The idea that the author of Liberty could father children with an enslaved woman was too uncomfortable to accept. Then, in 1998, truth entered not through words, but through science. DNA testing traced the lineage of Jefferson's male descendants, and those of Sally Hemings's youngest son, Eston. The match was undeniable. No theory could explain it away. The bloodlines met exactly where the whispers had always said they would. Centuries of denial fell silent before a fact that no historian could rewrite. In that moment, history changed, not because the truth had been discovered, but because it had finally been believed. The evidence did not create Sally Hemings's story, it simply forced the world to confront what it had long refused to see. Her name, once buried beneath euphemisms and omissions, returned to the record, not as rumor, but as reality. The silence that had hidden her was centuries deep, but not eternal. The past has its own way of speaking, through walls, through blood, through the small traces left behind by lives that refuse to vanish. History does not forget. It only waits to be remembered. The story did not end with Jefferson or with Sally. It lived on through their children, through generations that carried both names and silences across centuries. Some of Sally Hemings's descendants stepped into the world as free people and vanished into the current of white America. Their skin, light enough to pass unnoticed, allowed them to claim a freedom that had once been negotiated in whispers. They married, worked, raised families, and never spoke of the house on the hill in Virginia. Their history became an inheritance of absence, a truth folded deep into their blood, never spoken aloud. Others remained tied to the name Hemings, refusing to let the line be erased. They carried their ancestry with quiet pride, through years when no one wished to hear it. They kept stories that official history ignored, stories of a woman's strength, of the children she bore, of the freedom she bought for them through silence and endurance. In their families, the past was not forgotten. It was guarded. As the years turned to centuries, the lines that once divided began to blur. What had been hidden in shame began to surface in acknowledgement. And then, something that once seemed impossible happened. At Monticello, the house that had separated blood by law and color, descendants from both sides began to gather. The first reunions were uneasy. White descendants of Thomas Jefferson walked the same grounds as the black descendants of Sally Hemings. For some, it was the first time they faced the truth not as history, but as family. They stood beneath the same columns their ancestors built and served under, their reflections crossing in the polished floors of the great hall. There was no master now, no slave, no silence strong enough to divide them. Only the shared weight of what had been, and the fragile grace of what remained. In those moments, Monticello ceased to be only a monument. It became a place of reckoning. The laughter of children echoed across lawns once marked by boundaries of race and power. Descendants, once separated by the violence of history, broke bread together beneath the same roof. The air that had once carried the sound of command and obedience now carried voices speaking in remembrance. Time had softened what once was unthinkable. Shame gave way to recognition, denial to understanding. The house that had been built on contradiction now held a gathering of truth. They walked its halls not as property or patriarchs, but as people bound by the same lineage, blood once divided, now acknowledged. They walked the same halls now, not as master and slave, but as family. At night, Monticello changes. The tourists are gone, the voices fade, and the wind slips through its corridors like a memory that refuses to rest. The house stands in silence, its columns pale under the moonlight, its windows reflecting the faint glow of the past. Beneath its polished floors, beneath the symmetry and grace that once defined it, something stirs, not in sound, but in feeling. It is as if the walls themselves breathe with what they have seen. If you stand there after dusk, near the south wing where the hidden room was found, the air grows colder. The stillness thickens, and for a moment, you might think you hear something, the faint rustle of fabric, a soft footstep in the dark, a whisper of a lullaby no one remembers the words to. Some say it's only the wind moving through the old stone and timber. Others say the house remembers. Every corner of Monticello carries a trace of what it once held, the laughter of children who could not bear their father's name, the sound of chains in the early dawn, the quiet hum of a woman who lived between captivity and love. The rooms are heavy with what was never written down. The plaster hides it, the paint smooths it over, but it remains. Each brick bears witness. Each nail, each worn stair, carries a piece of truth too heavy for paper. The house has seen everything, the ideals and the hypocrisy, the birth of freedom and the bondage that built it. In daylight, it stands as a monument to genius and progress. But at night, it becomes something else, a keeper of contradiction, a vessel of memory. It does not accuse, yet it does not forget. It holds within its walls the story that the nation itself once refused to face. Monticello has become more than the home of a founding father. It is a living relic of the American soul, the beauty and the blindness, the dream and the debt. The room behind the wall, the secret it held, is not only Jefferson's. It belongs to all who have loved this country while being denied by it. It belongs to the generations who still walk beneath its shadow, searching for a place in the light. Every nation has a room it keeps hidden. This was America's. Sally Hemings was never free in her lifetime. Her days were shaped by boundaries she did not choose, her name erased from the records of the very man who shared her bloodline. Yet her truth endured, through centuries of silence, through denial and disbelief, through every hand that tried to rewrite her story. The man who built a nation built her prison too, but she gave life to a future he could not erase. Her children walked into a world that refused to name them, yet they carried her strength within them. They bore the promise she secured. Freedom not for herself, but for those who came after. And in that quiet victory, she transcended every wall that confined her. She never left Monticello in body, but her story crossed oceans of time. It reached us, piece by piece, through blood, through memory, through the unbroken will to be known. The truth that once hid behind brick and silence now stands in the open. The walls of Monticello no longer whisper her name, they speak it. And in doing so, they speak for all the lives built in the shadows of liberty, all the women whose histories were folded away to preserve a man's perfection. To remember Sally Hemings is to confront the truth of a nation that preached freedom while practicing bondage. It is to see the full reflection in the mirror Jefferson built, beauty, brilliance, and unbearable contradiction. When we speak her name, we open that hidden room again, not to expose, but to understand. To let the air of honesty touch the walls that once held silence. To admit that within the house of freedom, there was a woman who waited for centuries to be seen. In the house of liberty, there was a locked door. And behind it, a woman waited to be remembered. Click on the like button and subscribe for more.